recording. Fantastic. All right, everyone, welcome today to day 3 of Campus Climate Corps broadcasts. As always, my name is Rock, and I'll be one of your hosts for today. We also have Dr. John Capice on the line here. For all of you folks joining us on Facebook Live and Zoom, welcome today. We'll get a PowerPoint started here, just show you a little bit about some of the major overviews, so the big news that came out of the COP Day 3 briefing today. And then we'll dive into some of Dr. John Capice's experiences as he went around COP today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and, John, actually, would you like to introduce yourself first before we get started?
That's fine. I'm John Capice, and I've known Rock for quite a long time, and he's been working with me in Campus Climate Corps since 2015. When he went with me and several other students and other volunteers to the Paris Climate Conference. And since then, he's been attending each one of these UN conferences, representing Campus Climate Corps. And Campus Climate Corps, as I'm sure Rob has explained to you, is a program administered by two organizations, Intelligentsia International, which is a student exchange group that I manage, and we've hosted 500 students from 74 countries for 2 to 12-month programs since 1999. We've been around longer, but hosting interns since then. So my specialization technically is agricultural engineering. I used to be faculty, University of Florida. I now run these nonprofits. In addition, you'll see these logos next to me. I serve as Kissimmee Waterkeeper, which is an advocacy group. So we've got Intelligentsia International oversees both Campus Climate Corps and Kissimmee Waterkeeper. Both are programs underneath it. And the other organization overseeing Campus Climate Corps is Alpha Epsilon Lambda, the National Honor Society of Graduate Professional School Students. And I'm proud to say that Rock is now a national member of that organization by virtue of his scholastic achievements and his leadership accomplishments in having represented Campus Climate Corps in these UN conferences over the years. So very much enjoy working with Rock and many other students around the world and around the US, around Florida on these important projects.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. And without further ado, let's get started on some of the major news that came out of COP today. Something a little bit expected that I think doesn't really need too much explanation, but everyone finally came to a consensus that heat waves are caused by climate change for some reason. It was decided that some of the major heat waves that struck Europe last year were a result of climate change and global warming. Funny that it took that long. However, I think it's a pretty important note that some of the doubters, even within the European Union, who still doubt climate change, are still receiving this factual realization that heat waves will continue to affect Europe in the summertime, as well as far colder winters due to the trade winds and the slowing of the winds around the Atlantic Ocean. In other news, the Energy Charter Treaty, which is an international treaty recognized by the United Nations, was found to pose a significant threat to efforts to curb climate change. Now, one question you might be asking is, what is the Energy Charter Treaty? And that essentially allows insurance companies and other companies that are working in the insurance industry to sue governments if they start hurting their big margin profits. So essentially what these companies are saying is, if you present new laws that are hurting our ability to make money, it allows us to sue you as an organization. And that type of concept, at least, was found today to be a significant problem in hampering effects or efforts to curb climate change. Another news, country pledges that COP26 officially would limit temperature rise to below CO2 degrees Celsius, found by the University of Melbourne. In other words, at the very least, the pledges that countries have been making, the stronger NDCs that have been agreed to over the past few days, or at least the commitments offered by some of the world leaders, at the very least, what's on paper is shown to be now below 2 degrees Celsius if we're hitting those numbers. Now, that's a big if, that's a massive if. But if we do follow through with the guidelines and the commitments that we've made, and the new commitments, the NDCs that these countries have been making, then yes, we would limit sea level, we would limit temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius. But again, that's a huge if. In other news, more than 20 countries and financial institutions have vowed to halt financing for fossil fuel development overseas and divert the estimated $8 billion a year to green energy. This includes countries like the United States and Russia and China. Now, why is this important? It's because a lot of the future investment, or at least what we would see in terms of projections for how much and where we're spending our money, or at least where countries and financial institutions plan on spending their finances, investing in future years, right? At least we're making sure that those investments no longer include fossil fuel developments such as coal, oil, and potentially natural gas plants as well. Another news today, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero finally came together officially. Now, what does this mean? It means that institutions, a bunch of banks and financial sector institutions worth collectively over $130 trillion, more than the $100 trillion that is needed from these major financial institutions that is needed to meet the 2050 net zero targets. In other words, all of these major financial institutions have come together and they've said that we're going to collectively stop investment in fossil fuels. We're going to instead try to invest more in clean energy and renewable resources. Now, that's a huge, $130 trillion is a huge number. And that doesn't mean that we're investing $130 trillion. It simply means that financial institutions who collectively are worth $130 trillion are now promising not to invest any of their future money into fossil fuel development. And now we're going to go over to Dr. John Capice, who's going to give you a brief rendition of some of the things that he saw today over in the COP conference. John, all you. You're muted, by the way.
Unmute.
There you go.
Before I share my screen, I first want to point out that I see we have Amanda Heinzman on the Zoom, as well as Lacey from the Florida Climate Institute. The step that Amanda Heinzman took to sponsor the conference at University of Florida that we held on Sunday was very important, not only to the students at the University of Florida, but it also allowed us to put into motion our plans for doing these daily briefings. And once I had committed to doing these briefings with Rock and going to the expense of moving us here and securing housing and so on, it made sense to try to scale that up to include other organizations. So the Waterkeeper backdrop you see here goes with the series of briefings we're also doing for the waterkeepers around the country. And we're getting very good turnout in those events, 30, 40, 50 people showing up on those Zooms, and then many more watching afterward. But that wouldn't have been possible if Amanda hadn't stepped up and agreed to host the conference at UF. So her actions and those of her fellow members of the UF Agricultural Economics Club really leveraged resources and made possible similar activities for other organizations benefiting many more people. So I'd invite you to go over to the Kissimmee Waterkeeper Facebook page and watch some of those broadcasts as well. There's a lot of very interesting content and interviews there that were made possible by the actions and leadership of Amanda. So I first wanted to recognize that accomplishment on her part. So now I'll try to share a video here if I can. And this was the first encounter I had once I entered the pavilion hall of the UN conference. And this is the pavilion of the Central Asian nations, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. All of these were former Soviet republics that are now independent and struggling to develop their countries. And we had an office there. Intelligentsia had an office there from 2004 to 2012. And we had maybe 50 students go through that office, perhaps 10 at a time as employees. They've all gone on to great careers in various organizations. They have United Nations posts. Some of them are faculty at various universities, and they've all done very well. So I attended the seminar here, and it relates back to students and student priorities in higher education, and I'll discuss that with you. But this is the typical layout of one of these smaller pavilions, national pavilions, where they'll have exhibits, they'll have a translator room, they'll have media, they'll have seating, and then they'll have a program, a series of presentations that they're doing each day in their pavilions. So let me see if I can stop sharing this, and I need to turn that.
John, you mentioned something before about a lot of people attending on Zoom for that meeting.
Yes, and I'll show you that at the end here. They had quite a few people, and that speaks to how this conference. Thank you to our audience for attending. Oh my goodness. Okay, then let's see if it tries to speak on this one. From current slide. All these. Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm going to have to make some adjustments to this, and see what we can do. This is a chart that shows the pavilions in the center, and there were 97 of these various pavilions. Some are individual countries, some are collections of countries, and some are various UN agencies and other international bodies. And while I make adjustments to this slide set to eliminate the sound, why don't we turn it back over to Rock, and he'll add some notes to his experience at some of these pavilions in past years while I make a quick adjustment here.
Yeah, sure. And I'll even comment a little bit on what I was seeing yesterday at each of these massive pavilions. It really does seem that COVID did not really have that much of an impact when it came to scaling down or even maneuvering or providing new regulations. I think that the only difference between here and Madrid is that the Scottish event campus where this is being held is a bit larger than Madrid, but also the mask mandates are the only thing which is really preventing the spread of COVID at these events. Oh, but there's also these daily COVID tests, which are pretty simple. And within 15 minutes, you get your result. It's pretty interesting. However, I would honestly say that they're really not taking COVID as seriously as some of us would have hoped. I think we shared a few images on yesterday's video of just people crammed into these spaces in trying to get in line. I think Michael Fidler, our official cameraman and director of Intelligentsia as well, when we were in line, we were probably standing in line for about 45 minutes, and back to back, hundreds of, I mean, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of people around us. 2 days ago, getting into the event when Joe Biden was first making his appearance and Boris Johnson were making their appearances, there was at least 4,000 people in line. And this was just back to back. Of course, not very COVID regulation friendly at all. And in previous years, excuse me, in previous years, pavilions can get pretty massive. The Qatar pavilion was probably about 2,000 by 2,000 square foot in previous years. And I think it's probably about the same this year, if I'm not mistaken. The only cool thing about them is they do provide some fresh food, which can sometimes help with those of us who are students attending the event who don't want to spend exorbitant prices buying. And that's also another interesting thing. I read a really interesting article today that There's too much beef and too much chicken being served at this COP26 event. So much so that they made an international scandal out of it when CNN released the factoid that although it's 60% lower than in Madrid, and by Madrid, I mean there was Burger King everywhere, but even here, a lot of the sandwiches are burgers. A lot of the, excuse me, it's not so much fatless chicken or meatless chicken. There's just too much of the hypocrisy going around to spare. Not to mention all of private jets that a lot of these world leaders are taking to and from COP26. Anyway, John, are you ready to take back the wheel?
I am.
Okay.
But if your comment about the beef and the chicken is very interesting, and it relates back to the topic I raised during the conference, speaking about economics and accounting for the various carbon footprints of different production systems. And when you look at the food production systems relative to carbon impacts, beef is way up at the top, but surprisingly, just below that is worse than chicken is like salmon. Salmon that's raised in tanks, and because they consume other fish, they don't eat plant material, they eat other fish. So that fish are harvested from around the world and shipped to these facilities where they raise salmon in aquacultural settings. So you might think that seafood is less harmful than chicken or some of the other pork, but that you can't always be sure about these things until you look at the numbers, until somebody does a detailed analysis and really investigates. And so much of food technology now is moving towards artificial production of meat products and other substances under controlled conditions. It's very important to look at the current carbon footprint of these production systems, but not only the current carbon footprint, but where it may move in the future. Because as with solar energy, and we'll talk about that on another day, the initial solar energy it took 10 years to pay back the energy that went into producing solar panels and all the other infrastructure. Now it takes less than perhaps 2 years in many cases. So you can't just look at the current carbon impact, but you have to think about where the technology is likely to go in the coming decade and how much we can drive that down. So whereas artificial meat production may also have a high carbon impact in its early development phases, that too can be reduced through economies of scale and new technologies over the years and decades. So we often have to give some of these new technologies a chance and invest in them heavily so that we can drive down not only the price of these products, but their carbon impacts. So now I'll try to share with you some photos. We'll just go straight to the photo system. And before we can go to the UN conference each day, we have to take a COVID test. And that's a pretty significant investment on part of the UN to give every participant a set of like 12 or 13 of these at no charge. And there's no charge to attend this conference. There is no registration fee. If you tried to pay for a conference like this in the commercial world, it would be several $1,000s. And as I mentioned, the first pavilion I visited was that of Tajikistan and the other Central Asian nations. And you can see their flags here of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. Then you also have Tajikistan. And they were interesting in that they were talking, today the focus of the conference was on finance. So a lot of the pavilion discussion meetings focused on that topic, on finance. And what they were talking about in Central Asia was because these are smaller nations. When I say small, Tajikistan is about 7 million. I think the largest is Uzbekistan, and they have 35 million. So perhaps between all of them, they have maybe 50 million people. So that would put them, below Germany, below France, just collectively as the 5 nations. So they've teamed together to work collectively on addressing the climate issue on a programmatic level, which is good because many of their other environmental issues are also collective. Back in the early 2000s, I hosted a professor, Aurora Gadayev from Uzbekistan, and he was a specialist in water resources, and we did some cooperative work on the Aral Sea. And that's a really dramatic case where irrigation for crops has drained an entire lake. It's practically disappeared. It is maybe 10% of its original size. This was a huge saltwater lake or freshwater lake. And now, because of concentration of the salts through the small size, it's now approaching a saline status and virtually disappearing. And it's a really tragic case. But they're working together to try to develop some climate-related programs. And they're seeking financing. Again, that was the topic for today. And they're seeking financing for what they consider to be the overlap between their development priorities and what is seen as climate-friendly development. Now, the focus of their discussion was largely on hydropower projects, something Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have been working on for a long time. They have no fossil fuel resources, so they rely upon hydroelectric. They are in the border areas of the Himalayas, and they have extreme mountainous areas and large glaciers and glacial melt, which is becoming more rapid, rushing down some very treacherous rivers that they dam and try to produce an electricity. Now, the people in these nations get by with very little. Tajikistan has one of the lowest per capita income of any nation. There's maybe a dozen African nations with lower income, maybe not even a dozen, but they're pretty low on the scale. So they have needs there to develop for their population. So they're looking at developing their hydroelectric. So they're looking towards the UN for some of these climate development funds to help them achieve that. Well, in the Waterkeeper organization that I'm a part of, they're challenging hydroelectric systems in many parts of the world. So you have the Central Asian nations who were already pursuing hydroelectric and are now using climate money as a rationale for getting international support for this. You have the water keepers who were already opposed to hydroelectric dams because of their environmental impacts upon fish and the hydro periods of these rivers and such. And now they're using the climate change arguments to oppose these projects. So often you have organizations of all types that have agendas existing, priorities existing, and they're scratching their head and they're thinking how we get this to be a climate issue. So a lot of what you see is adapting existing economic or programmatic priorities into the climate scenario or situation context. So it's important to investigate each one of these and make sure that they, so to speak, hold water, that they are legitimate when it comes to their arguments relative to climate change. Though the water keepers would argue that in many cases, these hydroelectric stations accumulate a basin of water. And at the bottom of this basin of water, you have sediment accumulation. And under certain conditions, these things go anoxic and biological processes generate methane. So you have to study the types of sediments in the area, the accumulation rates, and how much these bodies are likely to generate methane if you're opposing them on the basis of climate impacts. Now, in Central Asia, their argument is that if they don't use hydroelectric, they're sort of reliant upon their neighbors, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, for natural gas and oil, fossil fuels, to fuel their development. So we've got a number of challenges and competing interests and priorities that are so critical. So as we went through this presentation of them talking about their hydroelectric situation and showing all the energy, water, land nexus, very important topic, bringing these issues together. They have a translator in a booth. Every one of these exhibits, every one of these pavilions has a translator. So you're given a little headset and devices. So just like at the United Nations, you get real-time translations of all these presentations. So they also had a number of people patched in via Zoom participating. So I was kind of surprised by that. I wasn't really aware that there were Zoom participants originally. So at the end of this presentation, they asked for questions. Nobody was asking any questions. It was basically the audience was other government officials from these nations, and they all sort of knew each other. And I realized, I looked around the room and I was the only non-Central Asian person pretty much in the audience. And none of them were asking questions. So I stood up and I asked about higher education and student involvement and faculty involvement in these programs. And I explained to them that Campus Climate Corps had an office, or Intelligentsia had an office there from 2004 to 2012, and how we work with their students. And they came back with a good explanation of how the faculty at these universities had been engaged in the development of these priorities and a lot of the rationale for them. So they had integrated their higher education resources in this program. And about the students, they talked about some pretty interesting challenges. And unfortunately, my experience matched with theirs, where they were training students, some highly capable students, but almost invariably their best students left the countries, left these Central Asian countries for careers in our countries, in the United States, in Europe, with the UN, with the Oxfam and these development organizations, so that we were in effect draining these countries of their human resources. The old colonialism was you'd send people in, they take over country, and they just steal the natural resources, rubber, coffee, cocoa, to fuel their own economies. But in the modern era, it's almost an economic human resource drain where, we had the slavery era where populations were extracted from Africa and shipped overseas. Now we're just dangling a carrot in front of their best people, and they're coming over to our countries very enthusiastically. So the net effect is still a brain drain and a resource drain on these countries. So we were talking about how to address that. And often what you have to do is not only improve your economy and make the salaries more attractive to people in their own nation, but you just need to overwhelm with supply. In other words, you need to ramp up your higher education system and just churn out more highly educated people who can hopefully certain sufficient number can remain in the country and assist with development. And these are going to be much more complicated because let's say you have a country feels an obligation or a necessity to use hydroelectric. Well, if there's a methane impact, maybe there are other ways to address this by modifying the sediment environment with oxygenation of these sediments or some other procedures. So there's a lot of scientific work and a lot of management work to be done, which all require a lot of highly trained young people. So I talked with them after the discussions about how we can help develop their programs in higher education through perhaps resumption of the remote partnership we had years ago. So it was a very interesting experience there in that pavilion. And then after the Tajik pavilion, I went over to the nuclear energy pavilion. Now, this is a very controversial topic relative to climate change. And, I think people consider it carefully. They understand that we absolutely must do research and development into a wide range of energy options and a wide range of other basic science and engineering directions. Whether or not and when and which technologies we choose to scale up is a separate question from the research and development. So I've always been a strong supporter of research and development in the nuclear industry. We have coming online, other nations will actually be developing what are called the Generation 4 nuclear technologies. The United States isn't quite at the stage of implementing them, although a lot of the basic science will come from the United States that makes these possible, as has the prototypes of these from the 1960s and 70s, like the molten salt reactors, the thorium reactors in particular. So other nations are developing this, and there's a number of other innovative technologies. Some of the interesting aspects of the thorium is that they consume, or they can be designed and managed to consume, the nuclear waste from our old light water reactors. So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves, and they're going to be having a number of presentations at this UN conference. And this is Sebastian, and he's perhaps the top nuclear consultant in Europe. And anywhere you go where they're talking nuclear energy in Europe, you will find Sebastian. So he's a wealth of knowledge on a number of topics related not only to nuclear, but all of the other energy sectors, because they have to look at their industry and their technologies and their science in relation to the competing or the alternative energy sources. So he has a lot of information to offer, and looking forward to attending some of his briefings. And a lot of these pavilions will have their own set of speakers and presentations, and to find them you have to go to their individual websites, and most of them have these QR codes available in the various nations. So here you see the map of part of the pavilions and a list of 97 of these pavilions. So you can imagine if visiting one pavilion for a couple of hours engages you fully in a conference, if you have 97 of these, each of them with say 4 to 6 hours of programming a day, there is just so much going on that you could not possibly engage all of it. And one of the most interesting pavilions is the Cryosphere, and they study the Arctic and the Antarctic regions, and they post their rapidly evolving presentation schedule in the old-fashioned way, and they also have it online. And then as you're going through the pavilions, you encounter these areas where the journalists accumulate, and you see all the cameras. And then here we have the Science Pavilion, and that was an overflow crowd of people trying to attend one of their briefings. The US Center, it was good to see the US Center, and not only with a good schedule of activities, but also a quote from a president that was encouraging, the process of the United Nations addressing climate change. So that's a big change from 2019 conference to this one. And then you'll have even some of the smaller countries like Ghana. And I've hosted a number of students from Ghana, great people. But they also not only had their individual country pavilions, but they will join together to have continental or regional pavilions. So some of the smaller countries who can't have their own pavilion like Ghana, like Ghana did, some of the less affluent nations will join together so they have a presence and a place for their people to work together at these conferences. And then alongside these pavilions, you have just halls and halls of these little offices. And that's where each of the pavilions, each of the countries have their offices for their delegations. And here you see for the Cryosphere, some of their sort of informational posters and the area where they do their presentations. And I will try to get to some of these presentations and report back on them, as will Rock. And then there's the Water Pavilion. And it was good to see that area. I look forward to attending their sessions. They had, it looked like about 30, 40 different organizations co-sponsoring that pavilion. And each of these also has an office where their staff work together to plan and implement their activities. So that's it. That was my day at the climate conference. It was very exciting, very interesting. I felt like a kid in a candy shop, just so much information, so much going on, so much to do. And I just wish that more students like Rock could attend these, and we will continue to try to figure out how we can bring more of this information, more of these experiences to students throughout the United States and other places. And I encourage all of you to work with Rock and other students to see if you can't help achieve that goal.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. I do have one question on the Facebook Live, I think. Let me pull it up real quick. Okay. Hendrik asks about nuclear. What type of nuclear are they advocating right now, especially that guy you mentioned on the slide? So I guess Sebastian, I think John, you and I have talked to him in the past, but maybe since you talked to him today and I didn't, was there any new information that he brought up? Any details, any specifics that you want to bring up? Anything on the direction of thorium or molten salt reactors?
Well, I haven't really heard Sebastian advocate a specific technology or commercialization. He's more of an information guy. He answers the questions, the nuts and bolts and the numbers of each of these things. I haven't, not that he doesn't advocate, it's just in his interaction with me, I've not heard him advocate any particular industry or technology. But I did raise the question about small modular reactors. And my classmate from college, and we were both student organizers of various groups. We created the Graduate Student Council together at University of Florida. His name was Juan Vitale. he created the Hispanic Student Union, and I was a graduate assistance officer. And together we got with Debbie Wasserman and we created the Graduate Student Council. So Juan is a PhD in nuclear science, and he is the top engineer in the US Army for nuclear energy. So he works at the Pentagon and he has a top post with US Army Corps of Engineers. His assignment or his expertise is in what's called small modular reactors. And these are variations on a number of nuclear technologies. They can embody, potentially thorium reactors or the pebble bed reactors, but they get away from the problematic light water reactors that have the hydrogen accumulation problem, and they tend to explode. And that's a bad thing, is to have a nuclear power plant explode. Then it moves from being a power plant to a bomb. But they're attempting to develop these small modular reactors, and the military has an interest in it because a lot of people get killed trying to truck in fuel when they have bases in Iraq, Afghanistan, or any conflict zone. You have to move in. If you have a base full of soldiers trying to operate, they need supplies. They need water and fuel. And those are two very large volume commodities that have to be transported in. And by having small modular reactors, they eliminate the need to truck in fuel. They also all of a sudden have enough energy to recirculate all of their water, to recondition all of their water, take all their wastewater, clean it up, and drink it again, just like the astronauts did. So that's an interest of the Army. Now, whether or not they're actually going to deploy that technology once they've developed it is a separate question from the research and development. It's very often the case that our military or space programs, or sometimes both of them, are loss leaders, as they call it. They develop the technology because they don't really face the same cost constraints that the rest of the economy does. They are not subject to, quote, pricing, because the psychology of people is they tend to be afraid. When they're afraid, they spend a lot of money on being unafraid or feeling safer. So the military gets an awful lot of money. Similarly, people are enthusiastic and supportive of space exploration program, so they often get a considerable amount of money. So the technologies that eventually trickle down, so to speak, to the rest of the economy have their start in the military or in the space program. Not that I advocate that should be the continuing model, to have all of the desperately needed technologies simply be an accidental byproduct of military programs, but that's the current state of affair and the easiest way to get research and development funded in this country. So you have a number of technologies that are being worked on and developed. I hear them talking a lot about small modular reactors. And Rock, you actually had some experience in investigating this question in one of your courses. Did you want to
Yes,
talk
that's
about
true. Right now, a lot of the presentation that I'm working on right now is the concept of conversion of the coal power plants, which are currently in the phase of being, currently we're phasing out, to convert to plants which house these small modular reactors, essentially using all the infrastructure currently in place that the coal power plant used to export the electricity, and simply replacing a few of the internal mechanisms for heating and for the production of steam and heat energy that would eventually be released as electricity from the coal power plant. Which is incredibly important because a large problem in China right now are their attempts to phase out what are essentially almost new coal power plants that they've created in the past couple of decades. So many coal power plants, what they say, have their half-life right now, meaning that it's a lot of the coal power plants that China invested in during the 80s and 90s and early 2000s are not yet at the point where they've made enough money or have justified being shut down from an economic standpoint from China's perspective. So a conversion of those power plants, in other words, the use of the infrastructure which was already put into place by simply transferring or changing some of the internal mechanisms of the coal power plant and transforming it into using a small modular reactor to transform it into nuclear power would save quite a bit of energy and greenhouse gas emissions if China's still trying to commit to the argument of saving their economy, but at the same time producing enough electricity and saving the planet as well. So I think that's another interesting argument to make and against the keeping alive of coal power plants is simply transfer them or transform them into nuclear power plants, these small modular reactors.
Well, interestingly, I sort of look at the composition of the participants or the staff at these various pavilions. And the nuclear pavilion was a small pavilion, a few meters by a few meters, but it was surrounded by at least 8 to 10 students. They're all wearing their t-shirts and I'm listening in on their conversations, and they're talking about graduate school and they're talking about postdocs and all the conversations you hear in a university group of students. So the students, the nuclear exhibit had the highest concentration of students of any of them at this UN conference. So I thought that was notable. What it perhaps says is the other pavilions need to get similarly active with their university students that are helping drive their particular disciplines forward as well.
Fantastic. All right. By the way, that was a really good question, Hendrik. Thank you for that. And I don't see any more questions on the Facebook Live Zoom, folks. If you have any questions, feel free to shout out your questions now.
I don't think these have to be questions. I think they can be comments as well. I would invite the students and other participants to simply weigh in with their comments. Sometimes people may have an objection to a certain line of discussion, and they'll often, for politeness, couch it in the form of a question. But I would invite them to offer their opinions and comments as well.
Sure. If anyone would like to jump on that train, please feel free to do so at this point. Who is representing the U.S. at the booth? Yesterday, Lacey, when I went to visit, they actually had a number of speakers from the State Department who were there. No high-profile people, more like undersecretaries and folks who, just simply work in the State Department.
Pretty big job. Undersecretary of a U.S. agency is a big job.
There was one undersecretary there, and then the rest were simply other folks who did work in the State Department without major titles too. But that's who I saw yesterday. And John, do you have any different experience today?
Well, you commented about State Department people being present. as I mentioned in some other discussions before the conference, when we were in the planning stages, actually months ago, I was privy to the email threads. They copied me. How they decided to add me, not quite sure. I think Juan simply gave them my address and they kept using it. But I'm on this list of email recipients, perhaps 80 names long, of their folks involved in the nuclear issue discussions. And there were about 40 agency, or I mean 40 to 80 people on these emails, depending upon the particular email, and they were from maybe 8 to 10 different agencies. Department of Energy, obviously, Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Labor, Department of Education, and so on. So every one of these presentations that you hear, there were maybe 25 of these different email threads going on. So if you divide that, that's like 2 per day. So that's well over 100 recipients that go into the planning of the sessions that the U.S. Center delivers at this conference. So it may seem like just a few presentations, but a lot goes into selecting who will do these and what they will talk about. Even if they're just not there physically, a lot of people at the various federal agencies have been involved in this process. Mm-hmm. And also people from the cities and other governmental units throughout the United States. Because what it appears to me is, I don't know that we have the other center. It's now the U.S. Center, which is perhaps a combination of what they had last time, which was the cities pavilion, and now they may have merged with the federal.
And one thing that you might notice going to these pavilions is you won't see any of the major big shots like John Kerry attending these, at least the US pavilions. They'll attend more of the large areas and gatherings, because mostly you'll see people thronged and crowded around folks like Kerry, folks like Nancy Pelosi, who was there at the 2019 Madrid summit. And then, of course, in 2015, when Barack Obama attended for the Paris Climate Accords, they won't typically go to the US Pavilion. That'll be for more of the educational, experimental, and other types of exhibits that will attend there. But folks like some of the major big shots that you might know from the news will typically go to massive rooms where they can fit 500 people in there to get a broadcast to the most amount of people possible, rather than the US Pavilion, which from what I could tell, there were no more than 40 chairs. And if those 40 chairs were occupied, they would ask you to stand outside the pavilion instead of thronging around throughout the middle of it. I think they were trying to encourage at least somewhat of a COVID precaution inside the US Pavilion today. At least the one thing that was beneficial from that perspective. John, any last words on that one?
No, I'm just looking forward to tomorrow. Get some sleep, try to get up early, tackle those buses that commute, and get in there and figure out these schedules. As we each year as we do this, it's important to bring more and more people into the process, because we cannot begin to review the schedules for all these pavilions and pick out the most high priority sessions for us to attend. So it's often sort of a hit and miss and random selection process. So the more people we can get involved in the promotion of these and the conferences next year, and the selections and the covering of the sessions to deliver these briefings, the more we can empower U.S. students throughout the country. So I encourage you students out there to get involved in this process next year.
I agree. We have 2 more comments. One is from Amanda. Really good points. She says, I think it's interesting that the small Central Asian countries are focusing so much on the environment, given that they face a lot of politically unstable problems like food insecurity and per capita GDP. Usually we would think of climate consciousness as being more expensive. Interesting to see developed nations holding developing nations in the same standards as well. And I think that goes back to your point, John, that a lot of their demands on the climate front are simply disguised as requests for their own food insecurities and GDP problems as on a local level. Whereas, the climate front is just one more front to request funding to help them develop, to the point where they can be sustainable.
That's true, but it's been my personal experience that the opposition to fundamentally transforming the way they do things comes more from the affluent. The affluent, they've got stuff. They know how to get stuff. They want to keep that, conveyor belt feeding them. They're not all that interested in changing. People with lower incomes that live more humbly, live more family oriented, they're more susceptible or more responsive perhaps to arguments about the future and about multiple generations into the future. Also, they don't have that much to change. They're not so invested in the systems and the technologies as their form of income. So if there are new technologies that are green and offer them development options, they're ready to embrace them. They're not clinging to old technologies. So it's often easier to get those populations, those economies, to engage in new innovative directions.
Good response. And last but not least, Lacey says, interesting. So have there been any energy justice talks or environmental justice talks at our pavilion or any other booths? It seems like this is growing in significance as a federal priority. I didn't see any just yet. However, each day seems to have a theme that the United Nations has requested each of the booths follow. From what I've seen so far, each of the booths hasn't exactly followed the United Nations request, but there is a climate justice theme selected for Friday, which coincidentally is the day that Fridays for Future is planning their massive rally in March, at which CNN projects about 100,000 people will be in attendance for. So regardless of whether or not our pavilion is actually going to talk about climate justice and environmental justice, there will most certainly be a demand for it outside, and probably to the extent of which you're going to be able to hear it no matter where you go from inside the building, if 100,000 people are marching out right outside demanding that too. So hopefully we will see some talks about it, but there's definitely going to be a larger voice outside by the young people demanding that we tackle that issue too.
Environmental justice is the theme in many of these presentations and discussions. It sort of runs as an undercurrent or as a core justification. Many of the pavilions are sort of dedicated to this concept, and their programs are centered around it. And I think what we can do tomorrow is try to focus on identifying those and help bring that back to you tomorrow and tell you specifically which pavilions are focusing on that and some of the programs, and maybe even give you some ways of tuning into them. But obviously the Central Asian nations, their whole situation is about environmental justice, and so to speak, from an energy perspective. The nuclear discussion, I was talking with Sebastian, and I was telling him that it's sort of my impression that we're currently fixated on net zero. Right? When are we going to achieve net zero for our current energy consumption? I think that is fundamentally misguided. Yes, we need to achieve net zero on our current energy consumption, but the reality is we are going to need, by the time 2050 or 2070 rolls around, we're probably going to need many, many times our current energy production. So substituting our current energy for renewables isn't enough. We're going to need many-fold times more of these renewable energies, whether it's solar, wind, sustainable hydro, or nuclear, or whatever technologies can prove themselves to be sustainable and compatible with long-term interest, because of two factors. One is not only is the population increasing, but those populations want to live the lifestyle we have, and we consume easily 10 times as much energy as many countries. So you take their populations and you ramp them up to our levels, you got 10 times as much energy consumption globally. So a wide range of technologies are going to have to deliver that energy supply. Then, in addition to the consumer multiplied by the per capita consumption multiplied by population function, you have the impacts of climate change ever worsening. And what happens when a climate destruction occurs? Reconstruction, rebuilding. That is a huge energy drain. There is so much that goes into rebuilding a coastal community, or moving a coastal community, or restoring various infrastructure, that takes a massive amount of resources, natural resources, including energy. Then, once we begin to reach net zero, we also face with the challenge of extracting all that carbon that's in the atmosphere. It's not going to be enough to just quit putting more in. We're going to have to take it out. We're going to have to extract it, not only from the atmosphere, but from the oceans. You can take it out of the atmosphere and it will re-equilibrate with the, you take it out of the atmosphere, it'll re-equilibrate with the ocean, so you can continue to extract it, because so much of it is gone from the atmosphere into the oceans. That's going to take huge amounts of energy. So we're going to need far, far more than just replacing our current energy consumption with renewables. So
Excellent.
that's a social justice, environmental justice question. And I think the underdeveloped populations, it's not about, I really don't like some of the tone that comes with the environmental, certain environmental advocates, justice advocates, where it's almost, you hear them demanding that we all die at the same pace from climate change. We don't want this group dying faster than the other group. It's almost an admission that we're all going to die from climate change, or at least future generations. And it's absolutely essential that we all die at the same pace. I think we need to move away from victimization from climate, and have environmental justice be equal opportunity to solve the problem, to grow and improve one's life by solving this problem. And I think that the developing countries and the underserved populations of this world, if we engage them properly, they will join in this battle, and they will be enthusiastic, and they will be among factors that helps us overcome.
Fantastic point. All right. Unless anyone has any other final points or any other points of discussion, I thank everyone who's joined today from Facebook Live and the Zoom today. Really enjoyed having all of you here, and please tune in tomorrow as we discuss some of the things that we're going to see tomorrow at tomorrow's COP Day 4 session. Wow, I can't believe it's already Day 4 already. John, any last words before we sign off?
I'm 61 years old. I'll probably be ready to collapse by day 12. Hopefully, you're younger. You'll get us through the home stretch.
I'll do my best. All right, folks. We'll see y'all tomorrow.